Hello and welcome to the Worshipful Company of International Bankers Mental Health panel in this week of mental health awareness. Welcome to our colleagues from the Chartered Bankers Institute and the CISI. Special thanks to the CISI, in fact, for allowing us to use their technology, and to Max Asmelash for putting this together with Rob Samuels. And the biggest thanks go to our panelists, Poppy Jaman, who leads the City Mental Health Alliance, and God knows how many of these panels she's doing this week. I'm not even going to ask you, Poppy. And to Andy Barker from the University of Hull, who lectures on mental health and works with the 306 Hospital Support Regiment, with which the WCIB has close ties. Welcome to you both. Now, we're going to have around 40 minutes of discussion and then open the floor to questions. And please put your questions in the chat box as soon as you'd like, because really it's your questions that we want to answer. As lockdown eases and we exit our houses like hibernating animals after a long winter, we should beware of the effect of blinding sunlight. Jokes about being unable to make small talk or gushing over people we barely know. But the reality is that for many, social interaction is an abrupt change from a very difficult period. We have a massive mental health crisis in this country, said the CEO of the FTSE 100. And the reason I quote him is because the corporate world 3 years ago, no CEO would have been caught saying something about mental health publicly. And we've got to that great point where they can. But what he's saying is terrible and true. And the crisis isn't age specific. It ranges from those of working age to children to the retired. Older people who live alone have been found to have lost confidence in their ability to navigate shops and social occasions with more than one person. Children may find it difficult to work in a loud classroom, let alone those who've fallen hugely behind. Professionals, and the session today is really about professionals, but we are all also parents, carers, and we wear lots of other hats. So everything is on the table. Professionals have lost any sense of the separation of work and play and are facing the dilemma of returning to the office full-time, part-time, not at all, let alone all those who have lost jobs and income and loved ones. Let's start with you, Poppy. 50 charities came together to write a letter to the Prime Minister asking for a new social contract for mental health. Your name was on that document. What exactly are you asking for?
Goodness, so there's been so many campaigns that we've been part of in order to keep mental health really high up the priority, Karina. And the new social contract, what we as charity or sector leaders were coming together is to say, actually, we really need to redefine mental health, not as a side issue and as a core issue of how to rebuild society. And I guess that sort of segues a little bit into the discussion today. Is at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw every board member, and I know Andrew's going to be talking about this as well, every sector, whether it was the charity sector, the corporate sector, SMEs, education, they were all talking about mental health. But more importantly, I would say they were asking the question, how are you? And genuinely listening. That in the business world wasn't part of the business conversation. And I guess one of my concerns is, as we start to get back to a bit of normality, the sun's out, I've got one blind, like that's not happened, the blinds are shut. We get back to sunshine, we get back to beginning to see our people, hopefully get back to hugging people again, like not to forget that, because complacency cannot be part of this narrative. And I wanted to just pick out two statistics in terms of what you've just asked me. With the ONS data show that more than 80,000 young people were referred to NHS services. That's 28% more than 2019 last year. And as you've already said, that's our kids. That's the future workforce. And 20% of that 28% increase were emergency care. we really need to pay attention to that, because the World Health Organization have already warned us that mental health is the next crisis that we're going to have to deal with, regardless of whether you're a business leader or a family member. That's something that's on our radar, and we just need to get equipped with it. And I guess going back to social contract, that's what we're asking the government, is make mental health part of everything, and actually let's really focus on this as part of the rebuild, because the economy depends on people, and that depends on our well-being.
Andy, do you have something to add to that from being on the front line?
I fully agree. I think that there, over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, there's been a steady increase in interest in mental health, awareness around it, multiple campaigns, a lot of discussion. And that's, you know, within the business of nursing. We've seen the Nursing Midwifery Council, the regulatory body, who have recently changed our standards for pre-registration nursing, so the standards that all higher education institutes need to ensure that students meet, to reflect that actually mental health is everyone's business. It's no longer just a side issue with a couple of lectures. It is ingrained in pretty much every single module, to talk about not just mental health within the care we deliver, but also our mental health for each other, especially in leadership and management sectors and forums. So I think that it is there, and we the lockdowns and the change in the pandemic has certainly again brought that to light, and people to have those conversations. And I hope moving forward that it's not just paid a level of lip service to, that it continues to be on everyone's agenda. We do consider it moving forward, and it becomes a real part of our natural day-to-day business.
What I see that's a bit worrying, Andy, is that, you know, the charities have stepped up. So the Samaritans, Place to Be for children, but the government just seems not to have the same. I mean, it takes money. It takes money, and all these extra children that Poppy was talking about who've been referred, you know, how many of them are actually getting help from the public sector? There isn't enough capacity, and money's not being spent on it. So Andy, what would you do differently?
That's a really good question. I think that there is something that reflects that actually services do need more input. They need. I'm all for change, but necessary change. So how we deliver care, how we deliver frontline mental health care, how we qualify and equip practitioners. But I think there's a step back from that. I think that there is this element that we can, you know, rather than just fighting fire with fire, so just waiting for people to come through the door, there's a step behind that in actually how we help each other, how we prevent mental health becoming a point where it becomes a diagnostic presentation, that actually, you know, those smallest things like conversations, how we have those conversations, revisiting our skill set in terms of having the conversations, is the most powerful thing. So I think it's a two-pronged approach. One is, yes, investment in services, both public and private sector, because there is a lot of private providers out there alongside NHS providers, but actually looking at education and you know, we've got the awareness, we've got the, you know, there's lots of campaigns about being aware, but what's the next step from that? It's empowering people to feel comfortable to say to somebody, I feel this way, or I'm not feeling too great, and knowing that that person at the other side of the table will be able to engage in a conversation that's meaningful. Because we all know that sometimes, you know, the old saying, problem shared is a problem halved, sometimes can be the biggest thing to stop things escalating to the point where you need a referral into services and where you need a referral in. So I think it's two-pronged really with mental health now. It's empowering us to have conversations, but empowering and supporting services, both public and private.
Poppy, do you want to just build on that?
Yeah,
I can see you dying to.
Yeah, I'm dying to. Well, the thing is, I'm just loving what Andy said, because actually, on a societal level, it's a culture change across our country in every home that we need, and taking mental health out of health services and into our homes has got to be the way forward, because it's going to require everybody to lean in on this. You're absolutely right, Karina. Like, the NHS is overwhelmed at the moment, and it's very difficult. You know, the waiting lists are getting longer for services. So that's probably one of the reasons that I guess Andy and I are advocating for this in such a profound way is, you know, if we actually get businesses at the peak of the pandemic, I saw a data, and I can't remember where I got this data point from, but about 10% of mental health services or support, I suppose, was being accessed through workplaces. Now, that means that there were probably more people getting help early because their workplaces had fostered the kind of culture that Andrew talks about. That means that there's probably less people putting a burden on the NHS, which means that because it's not being able to scale up to meet the level of support needed by people. So we, as workplaces in the finance sector, have a responsibility because we're a cornerstone of society. It's not just about profit, and it's not just about purpose for our people. It's also about, actually, if we get it right in the workplace, we can get help early, which prevents us getting unwell, which means that we can actually take a little bit of burden off while we're rebuilding the whole country after this tragic event. And then the other thing I would say about that is we're also a global citizen, you know. So at the moment, I've got family in Bangladesh, which is my birth country, but I've got a lot of friends who are in India. And in fact, I was speaking to one of the big investment banks earlier on today, who are a member of the City Mental Health Alliance, and they were talking about their employees in India and their business in India, and actually the impact of the pandemic, the number of deaths in just one team, and the grief and bereavement. So what is it that we have learned in the last 10 months that we can share quickly? Yes, we are culturally different, but there's a lot more similar to us than there is difference. And what is it that, you know, can we start having the conversations that Andrew's just talked about, and giving people that confidence and skills in other parts of our business worldwide, so that we play a much bigger part in the picture of recovery, which is going to take years.
You refer to the City Mental Health Alliance, and I mentioned that you're the CEO, but it occurred to me that a lot of our listeners probably don't know what it is, and yet they're all in the city. So would you just talk a bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the City Mental Health Alliance is the business community for mentally healthy workplaces. We've been around for about a decade. Our vision is to create mentally healthy workplaces and inspire health creation. And that, for most organizations, that's a bit of a leap. And what I mean by that is when all of your employees can say that they come to work because work is part of their well-being toolkit. So it gives them meaning, it gives them purpose, it gives them education around parenting for mental health. So it does all of those things that it actually enhances your life, so that work feels like a really good place to be. And without it, actually, there's an impact negatively on your mental health. And that's not just related to paying your mortgage and your bills. It's about the connections that we have with each other. It's about the community. It's about belonging. It's about inclusion. So that's our vision. We're in 4 countries: UK, Hong Kong, Australia, Singapore, and we're also developing chapters in US, India, New Zealand, Portugal. And so we've never been more busier. And out of this tragedy, one of the things that has come out is everybody's talking about mental health and coming to us to advise, like, how do we create a culture of mental well-being? How do we have the conversation that Andy's just talked about? Which health sector people do we need in the business to be thinking, so bringing health out of the health systems and the healthcare system into workplace, because without our people, we're not an organization.
Andy, based slightly on what Poppy was saying about, but you've both been talking about this, about talking. I saw a great phrase the other day, and I can't remember whether it was associated with a campaign or not, but it was, don't man up, speak up. Isn't that great? Don't man up, speak up. Do you want to talk to that phrase a bit?
Wow. Don't mind not speaking. I think it's one of these things where historically, culturally, mental health has certainly sort of kind of sat in the shadows. It's kind of been one of those elements that people have been either too ashamed or stigmatized to talk about. And it's, you know, the very traditional, quite wrong concept that actually, you know, stiff upper lip, you know, we just get on with stuff. And whilst I can understand that, and I can understand that there is certain sort of cultural attitudes within that, it's about actually taking that pause and thinking, well, actually, if you had an injury, if you had a physical injury, would you sit there and go, do you know what, I'm just gonna get on with this? Now, some people would, and you know, things recover. But a lot of us would actually go, do you know what, I'm gonna just ask my friend, what do you think to this? Or, you know, I'm not feeling too great. And they would probably say to you, go and see your doctor, go to A&E. You know, you go and seek out that care, or pop into your pharmacist, and you get that treatment and care that you need. There is no different with our mental health. And I think that when we think about mental health, sometimes we think of quite wrong, quite sort of very negative stereotypes of the old asylums, about being locked away, about that somehow that you will be removed from society, and that it, you know, yes, we do have mental health hospitals, but I can assure everyone here that the amount of time in mental health hospitals, if you would need that, would be very, very short and very limited. So there is a huge array of services and support long before we actually get to any of those sort of quite historical and wrong stereotypes. And it, you know, it is something that we keep meeting constantly. That is this, I don't want to talk about it because somehow that indicates that I have a weakness. And somehow that means that somehow I'm not as good or not as effective. And I think that tide is significantly changing. You know, from a military perspective, there is significant changes about encouragements, about talking about mental health problems, development of mental resilience skills for people on, from day one of joining the military. And in the NHS as well, talking about how we debrief and how we break down sort of situations and scenarios. And that has been ongoing throughout the pandemic, you know, and I think that, you know, when we say don't man up, speak up, it's about that actually stepping forward and going, it's okay not to be okay. You know, and it's been okay not to be okay during this pandemic. And we've allowed ourselves to be not okay and to say it's not okay. So when we go back to whatever life will be, you know, working face to face, it needs to be that mentality and attitude that continues to say, so we'll take time just to chat. We'll take time to make sure that we're okay. We'll take time to say, I'm not feeling too great today, and this is what I'm thinking and feeling. Because by doing that, it stops that bottle up. It stops that sort of immediacy of somehow that you're different or you're not right. Because probably everybody's sharing that same feeling and thought.
Absolutely.
That we heard during pandemic.
And in fact, you know, on the back of that and everything, Poppy, we have a question that fits in with this, which is, in a city environment where age-old stigmas are attached to mental health issues, bottom up, how can companies address the, quote, push to silence? Because it hasn't totally been, you know, we haven't totally moved on from that.
No, we absolutely haven't. And there's sort of two strands of thoughts that are in my mind at the moment. So one of them is leadership matters, you know, and leadership vulnerability matters. You know, when you've got chief executives of banks and you've got the governor of the Bank of England writing blogs, talking to his staff about the struggle that, you know, the pandemic has had on a personal level, on a leadership level, the conversations that they're having through surveys, focus groups. And in fact, I've seen some CEOs put mental health on the risk register with the mitigating actions and resources. That was like not even in my imagination 2 years ago to be even asking for that. But now that is in place, and that's forward thinking businesses. So all of those things give very clear messages that your leader is human and actually they're open to having this conversation of struggle. Struggle doesn't mean burnout and it doesn't mean depression. It just means that actually we haven't got the amount of energy that it takes to do all of these things because of the multiple accumulative stressors. And actually, if we talk about it, we can problem solve together. It's that simple, really. And I think that's the way that I have seen businesses address this, is by applying business acumen. So what are big organization and strategy leaders and CEOs and CFOs good at? They're good at putting a brilliant strategy together to solve a problem through whatever mechanisms and means that business does its business through. And that's what I'm saying to everybody is leadership need to give out the right messages. This problem needs to be identified as a business problem and not a HR issue. Then apply a strategy, put proper resources, measure something at board level so that actually you can see the progression, and actually have a little bit of a risk appetite for this. Because if we had a bookshelf that we could take guides off of and go, this is how you do it, then we wouldn't be in this place. Mental health, as Andrew says, is still an emerging narrative on what good practice looks like for a 10 people organization and a 500,000 people organization. Like we're still building all of that. And so while we do that, we have to build the evidence alongside it. And that requires measuring things and telling the world this worked and this didn't work. That's how we make change and we make progress. So and I have seen that is not, this silence, I think is a very old-fashioned term now. It is, if you're silencing the speaking up culture, what we're seeing is employee activism on the flip side of that. And we've seen, many businesses in the media recently for long working hours culture or not supporting employees appropriately. And actually, so the younger generation are turning to social media, they are speaking up. And actually that's a really good sign, because it means that we're cultivating young people to go, this is not good enough, but then you have to respond to that.
I love the fact that those Goldman Sachs, those young trainees at Goldman Sachs actually came out, did a whole video for their management, a PowerPoint presentation for their superiors saying we're working too long, too many hours. I love it. That would never have happened before. And the fact that they're still there, and Goldman Sachs felt it had to say, well, we will be looking at this, etc. Has Goldman Sachs changed? I don't know. But once that conversation has been opened up, it's very difficult to sort of thrust it down again.
I think the one thing that I would say about that is, Karina, as well, is that Goldman Sachs and others, have been in the media for this, and for this, how do get it? On the one hand, it's great because actually employees are speaking up and going, we deserve better working environments, and it will accelerate change. But the other thing I do wonder around that kind of activism is, how do we teach our younger generations to negotiate internally, influence internally? And I think in the pandemic Zoom culture, I think there's a bit that we need to be thinking about around how are we teaching each other to grow organizations together. And I'm all for employee activism and calling out bad behavior and whatever that looks like, whether it's in racism or sexism or mental health discrimination. But I think there is, one of the things that I worry about is that inclusion may be compromised, and development of sort of softer skills around negotiation, around communication, because we're not able to be in the office together as we were before. So those are some of the things that I've been really thinking about in terms of the future of work and the emergence out of the pandemic and this sort of hybrid working. How do we teach the next young generation to be amazing leaders and be calling out bad practice, but also be actually able to negotiate change in a way that is going to impact all of us positively? Because one of the things about employee relations issues is if something does spill out, whatever that might be, and I'm a leader and I've experienced those things within my organizations in the past, it has an impact on everybody's mental health. It has an impact on your manager's mental health. It has an impact on their manager's mental health. And so there's a bit of me which is like, well, how do we actually do that stuff better so that we're not move away from blame culture and move into working together, closer, better, stronger for all of this stuff?
Andy, how do we do that?
It's a really, really good question. I think that one of the most important points for me is the fact that actually we have lost that coffee chat, as I would call it, in terms of just being able to pop into someone's office or pop to someone's desk and just say, what do you think? I'm experiencing this. I'm not sure about this. What and when you're in this sort of virtual, for me, there is a lot of missing some of those vital human cues in terms of non-verbals or people are busy and I think sometimes, especially if we're talking about mental health, sometimes we can misjudge people's own mental well-being, because you miss sort of somebody coming in or crashing around or they're being pulled left, right and centre. So you miss those sort of key elements. And when you're in this type of environment, you don't know what's going on. You don't know what's happening in the other room for someone. And we have to remember that we are entering into somebody's home environment sometimes. And especially with Zoom calls, especially Teams calls and things like that, this isn't the office. This is somebody's home that we are talking into, and you don't know necessarily what's going on behind the camera and laptop. So I think sometimes it's going to be very incredibly difficult, I think, for those sort of 16, 17, 18-year-olds that are going to go into higher education and apprenticeships and things like that, about actually navigating what the workplace looks like, because I'm sure that over the next few years, we will all be sort of adjusting to sort of this hybrid between working from home and working in the office. So I think that there's going to be some glitches. There's going to be some sort of rewriting the textbooks and rule books, as it were, to kind of navigate sort of this new sort of way of working. And I don't think necessarily it's always going to be easy, but I think that both employees, managers, and leaders will all have to take a responsibility in taking that pause before we engage back with the information we're getting, to kind of make sure that it's sensitive, but make sure that actually somebody feels heard or listened to.
Changing or moving on to another subject, that was there was a very interesting article in The Economist, and with thanks to Michael Manelli, who brought it up. They're saying in this article, on a global basis, suicide has become rarer in the pandemic than before. And they were looking at it on a global basis. I don't know whether it was all countries, but presumably countries where you could get the data. And they thought it might be due to financial support from governments. What do you think?
I think from what I'm seeing is that there's a lot more access to people who want to talk about their self-harm and suicidal ideation, and often sometimes that there is a difference between the two. Sometimes there's an overlap as well. I think that obviously financial implications right now, especially with furlough and things like that, will have changed sort of the nature and degree of how people are responding to working, and I think that it will be interesting to see in the next sort of 12, 24 months what actually happens when we're returning back to that normality, I say, when that financial support has kind of been removed or is changing to certainly significantly less, and how people respond, especially smaller businesses, smaller enterprises, those levels of unemployment, whether they rise or sustain, I don't know. So yes, possibly. But I'd also be sort of interested to see. Sadly, I probably expect a spike over the next sort of 12 to 24 months. This is the reason why these conversations and supporting conversations and supporting that sort of initial conversation is a preventative measure is so important.
Prevention is always, it's what the NHS has had difficulties with, because it was created not with that specific aim. Not like Chinese medicine, you go to your Chinese doctor to prevent things happening. If things start going wrong, you say, well, what have you done wrong? Which seems so like the right idea. But in the West, we have a totally different attitude, which is you go to the doctor at the hospital when something is terrible. And Poppy, how can we bring more of this prevention into our societies?
Yeah, I mean, to that Economist piece, I haven't seen it. And I think if it is true, brilliant, because one life lost to suicide is too much as far as I'm concerned. But I think coming back to what Andy was saying, you know, we 1.7 million people are unemployed in this country right now, and nearly 400,000 redundancies were made during the pandemic. The implications on people's financial health and the health inequalities increasing, because actually the people that are on low income under 35k, who are those people? They're often single parents, there'll be more women, there'll be black and brown communities, Bangladeshi community particularly have been called out for being in the lower end of that spectrum. So I think we've got, it's too early to be making those kind of predictions. I think we need to focus on prevention. And what does that look like? So Every Mind Matters is something that is a platform that was launched by Public Health England. I helped in the early days of that platform. Thank goodness we had it pre-pandemic, because it was the number one resource in every NHS letter that came out. So I think, we need a stronger public mental health messaging. We've made a really good start in this country with the Every Mind Matters platform, but actually, what would I want? I would want to see every people manager skilled to have a conversation around mental health. It doesn't require 7 days training. It requires half an hour, 40 minutes, 3 hours on a Zoom call to get every people manager trained up. It's a life skill, and it's a business and a skill, and frankly it's just the right thing to do. So that's what I would be asking for. If there's one thing that we could change systemically across the country, is let's all lean in and get educated ourselves, or create the education that's required, as Andy said right at the beginning.
It's interesting you talk about that, Poppy, because we're both involved in various campaigns, but one of the things is the Lord Mayor's appeal. We supported the Samaritans in this project, where what we'd found in the city is people wanted to help, but they were scared that if a colleague, is showing signs of distress, and if you say, what's wrong, you then end up having to sort of deal with all sorts of things which you are not prepared to deal with, which you're just totally not ready for. And so the Samaritans came up with some very easy online training. It's exactly what you say. It doesn't take up lots of time, which is, how do you ask the right questions? And in a lot of corporates, you now have resources. So if there's a need to go beyond just talking to this person and keeping up a conversation, the resources are there. Now, the Samaritans have done that. So again, it's private, but it's totally free. It's online for anybody who's listening to this. I would say it's totally worthwhile. But Poppy, you and I are working on something, and as I'm moderating this, I have the right to bring it up. The hidden worker, or See Me. It builds on what you've been saying earlier about how mental health ties up with inclusion and exclusion. Would you like to talk about it a bit?
Yeah, absolutely, Karina. So, about 8 months ago, me and you got on a call and got really fired up. We'd met for the first time, and we got really fired up about the fact that health inequalities was increasing, and actually, so my organization, the City Mental Health Alliance, most of our focus is at board level, is at manager level, is at senior leader level. But what we recognized was who was looking after the hospitality staff, the security staff, the cleaning staff, the people that were on low incomes and may also be part of the supply chain, but not an employee. So they often didn't have the online resources that big corporates had for their employees, and actually it just took us, someone to agree it, press a few buttons, and then communicate that, and very quickly you've got access to well-being resources, possibly employee assistance programs that are already being paid for but underutilized. And so in recognizing that actually many of the city's workforce, the people that were key workers of the city that were keeping the city going during the pandemic, weren't necessarily getting the support that they needed, and how could we actually get the big corporations to recognize that? And what's been great is they recognize it and they've already were doing work around it. So Legal and General, PwC, Deloitte's, they've all gone, actually Lloyd's been particularly good at going, we're doing stuff around this. So what you and I are now trying to do is bring that group together and see whether we can actually launch a campaign which builds on the Green Ribbon and the This Is Me campaign, which was focused on mental health. So this is me, I'm Poppy, I've lived with depression and anxiety, but I'm also a CEO and I'm a mother. That was the This Is Me campaign. And now what we're saying is actually, could we develop a campaign that we know, based on one that we know that was really successful, about recognizing the key workers of the cities of this country, and try and reduce that sort of the widening gap between the have and the have-nots. Because again, we have a responsibility to do that, because when you look at the death toll and the disproportionate death tolls of the pandemic, the grief and the trauma that some communities are facing are more than others, and that's unfair, that's unjust, especially when we're able to amplify our support, resources, education in a very simple way.
Absolutely. So I think you should all look forward to this campaign, because of course we're going to launch it, Poppy.
Yes, it's coming. It's coming.
Andy, a number of people have talked about, nations suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And there's a bit of me that feels a bit uncomfortable with this, because, having been, for example, in Sierra Leone, what post-traumatic stress disorder really is. Are we exaggerating?
No, simple as that. No, it is, we always seem to associate PTSD with some significant trauma or something major. And the reality is post-traumatic stress disorder is not an emergency service diagnostic. It's not an army diagnostic. It is anybody can experience post-traumatic stress disorder. It is something that in the world of healthcare at the moment in time, it is a real concern. During this pandemic, I've done some work with the Care Home Network in Sheffield and the Hospice Service in Sheffield. And the majority of my work with that was originally just some teaching about moral injury and about our concerns about when we feel dissatisfied with jobs and frustrations. And it turned into more reflective practice and group supervision in which people were able to talk. Now, I'm not going to labour the point, but the manner in which people pass away from COVID is very different to what would somebody normally experience as a death. So, for example, COVID, the volume of death and the nature of death of COVID is the significant concern for the workforce, the NHS workforce at the moment in time. So it's important that in supporting the workforce, we provide arenas and platforms and staffing that can have those sensitive conversations to talk through those experiences. Now, it isn't something that I suspect we will see straight away. PTSD can manifest itself in many different forms over significant periods of time. But what we also have to remember is it's not just a diagnosis for those seeing trauma in terms of the workplace. Anybody on this call whose life, who they may be going through difficult times or may have a traumatic event or may something difficult has happened during this time, may experience that. And it manifests itself and comes through in many different ways. And people will often talk about flashbacks and night terrors and those type of things, but there are a range of symptoms around that. And it's important that if people are struggling, that they do start talking and sort of saying, I've had this experience, it was really tough, it was really difficult. And the military introduced something called trauma-related incident management, TRIM, which is employed in civilian society and civilian world and emergency services as well, about experiencing a trauma and supporting it and going through that to have a discussion that you can process that in a healthy way and express the emotion associated with that, and to try and prevent that risk factor, because not everyone, we can all go through and see the same thing, but doesn't mean to say that what somebody may develop PTSD, somebody may not. It depends on many different circumstances. So for me, that PTSD is a real threat, it is an actual threat, and we can prevent it by suitable sort of conversations. And it was one of the reasons why I originally went into the Nightingale and Yorkshire and Humber to set up training. Luckily, Yorkshire and Humber Nightingale wasn't used, was to set up training so team leaders would have the skills to kind of have those conversations, and not just to go, well, it's a death, but to actually sit down with their team members and go, okay, let's talk about it. Let's go through that. Let's process that together as a team.
Going to your earlier experience in Sierra Leone with Ebola, it was really a precursor, because if you think about it, you know, everybody who was dealing with it was just covered in the whole safety equipment. It was lonely deaths for the people who died. They couldn't have any family, anybody around. And what was the sort of PTSD that came out of that? And other than talking, what else would you recommend?
So the Ebola crisis, the manner of death due to Ebola, there was obviously, it's quite traumatic, and those that worked in the Ebola treatment centres, both host nation and sort of NGOs and the military, that there is that frustration that you couldn't do more. You're limited in terms of your vision. You've not got necessarily that tactility where you would normally hold somebody's hand during that process. So there's a lot of frustrations. Sometimes a lot of that was a lot of what appeared to be PTSD was more around somebody adapting and changing and processing a death. So I think the conversation, actually, I keep going on about talking and conversation is important. But also there is a responsibility for those around. So with the Ebola crisis, the chain of command had a responsibility to look at the troops and look at who was at risk. And I think as a lecturer now, I have a responsibility to look at my students and look who's maybe at risk, and specifically at risk at the moment in time, because they're all frontline staff. Within my role as reservist, I'm aware of my troops and who may be at risk there, to make sure that they have extra support, because sometimes it's not about me having the conversation, it's about somebody who's suitable to have that conversation, and who is equally as qualified or has a better expertise to have that conversation. Now, expertise is sometimes somebody who gets on better with that person than necessarily I do. So
can I just underline that? Do you want to say that again? Because I think that's really important. Say that again.
It's sometimes expertise isn't just about having that skill. It's often somebody who gets on better with that person. It's sometimes who's got a better working relationship, who has a better interpersonal relationship, or who understands that experience, or may have got a better working relationship with that person to have those conversations. Sometimes not necessarily appropriate always for you as a manager or as a team leader to have that conversation. Look at what's in front of you, what resources you've got around you, and who's comfortable and who may be more skilled and equipped to kind of have that sort of conversation. And that's not just about skill set, it's about interpersonal relationship as well.
Poppy, do you want to add to that?
Everything he said. But just the example that was in my head at the time you were speaking, Andrew, was there's a couple of CEOs that I work with, and including our chair Brian Hayworth, who is the managing director at Lansdowne, and he talks about, actually it was his EA that made, him and others have spoken about, it wasn't actually their manager, or it wasn't necessarily other family members, it was someone that was working with their calendar and their diary, who would on the face of it be seen as the most junior person, but actually they were the person. And I can relate to that, when I've, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, I was really struggling, and I already live with a mental health struggle, so I was already aware that I might be unraveling quicker than other people. And I think I had COVID, but I don't know. I had all the symptoms, and it was early days, so we didn't have tests. But I remember one of my team members phoning me up and going, we're going to stop responding to your emails because you need to take time off. And actually, like, when you think about that, it was a junior member of my team telling the CEO, we're going to stop responding to your emails. It's quite a thing, but I loved it because I know that what I have done in my team is fostered the right culture so that we can support each other appropriately. And they were like, I've noticed that you're sending multiple emails about the same thing, because one of the things I do is I micromanage when I get stressed. So, you're coughing on every call, you look like you haven't slept, like we're just giving you a week that we're not going to respond to you, so what are you going to do about that? And it was like, well, I can't do anything about that, I'm on Zoom, so I'm going to take time off. But it was the most helpful conversation, and I guess that's to your point, isn't it? It's about rapport, it's about trust, it's about building that trust. And actually, it's not just about asking the question, it's also about, as managers, as individuals, socializing, what's in our stress container and what is our stress signature. So my team know that when I'm sending 50 emails about the same thing unnecessarily, I'm anxious, and actually that's playing out in my behavior in this way. When I'm got a foggy memory and aren't able to recall names and numbers and people, that's me, that's a stress indicator for me. I lose sleep, I stop eating, I eat less, I lose my appetite. So these are things that my team know about me. And I don't do it to say, well, I need to know about your stress signature. I do it to give a signal that I'm human and can you please look out for these signs? And if I'm behaving like this, I don't mean to be a terrible manager. I'm just not well. I'm just struggling. And when you do that, then your team share the same. And actually, we just build a relationship, and particularly on Zoom culture. I know I've seen my team. No, all of us haven't been together yet. So it had to all be done in that way. And I had to give more as a leader and a manager of myself in order to foster a culture of trust and well-being in the last year. And some of that was uncomfortable. Some of that was, I didn't want people to know that actually I struggle to eat, and I've told everybody now, it's on a million podcasts, and to explain, everybody knows what happens if Poppy's losing weight, it means she's probably stressed. And I haven't got a diagnosis of eating disorder, it's just one of the things that happen. So, and I'm fully aware of it. So it is, those conversations make us feel vulnerable, but that's why I say leadership vulnerability matters. It doesn't mean I'm weak, it doesn't mean I'm less able. It just means that I'm human. And if I'm communicating that, I'd rather my team call me at that stage and go, you need to have a week off, than 3 weeks later when I'm actually properly unwell.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. We've talked about talking, a lot about talking, but there are chemical aids, and really serious depression or really serious anxiety, you need medicine. You definitely need medicine as well, and it shouldn't be seen as the wrong thing to do. But recently, CBD, the non-psychoactive compound in cannabis plant, has been talked about a lot. And there's a CBD brand, Love Hemp, and it just signed a tie-up with an online mental health support service called Together All. You know, is this, Andy, something you would suggest? You know, should we be using CBD over the counter of it, you know, medicine is not medicine, really. I don't know what to call it. AIDS.
I would always say that if you are embarking on using something to help your mental health, then maybe you should always get professional advice. That's the nurse response, because if you're on other medications, there are counterindications and things like that. So you always have to be careful about natural remedies and herbs. However, that being said, there is a lot of evidence, and there's a lot of research trials that have been undertaken in America and Canada at the moment in time regarding CBD and its utilization and use. Now, it'll be very interesting to see how that's interpreted in the UK and where that sort of derives and pushes sort of treatment and availability of treatment in the UK. So I'm not against CBD. I kind of am aware of sort of some of the evidence that's around and out there at the moment in time. But I think it's one of those products that may be beneficial, but should always be done and taken in sort of conjunction with sort of medical advice. And it's the same with any prescribed medication. Medication for me regarding mental health offers support, offers help. It may not necessarily always sort of work on what's actually underpinning and what's driving it. So a lot of the times that sort of when I've worked professionally, medication helps somebody get to the point that they maybe can talk about their experiences or can talk about what they're going through. And I would always say to people that if offered medication, consider it, talk to it, but it's not necessarily always the be all and end all. Medication will help you feel better, but some of the issues or problems underneath you may be able to resolve yourself and work through, but you may also need somebody that's suitably qualified to kind of help that. And it's one of those things where, you know, when we talk about a antidepressant medication, you know, you can be talking between 6 to 8 weeks sort of for it to kick in and to kind of get into your system. So there's medication has its place, and it can be very helpful, it can be very useful, and I will always advocate that if people are recommended it, they consider it, but also consider the fact that actually there are other treatments available. There are more talking therapies. There are that should you get to that point and should you need it, it's something to think about to work alongside medication. So CBD for the future, brilliant, but I'm also aware that they've also been looking at psychedelics for treatment for PTSD. So again, there's mental health, medication is being looked at. So again, reflects sort of, especially the drug industry and the pharmaceutical industry's attitude that actually it's a growing market and it's something to be invested and looked into.
Thank you, Andy. Now we have 68 people on this call and I don't have any questions. So I'm going to continue asking.
I think there's questions in the Q&A.
Sorry?
I think there's questions in the Q&A. If you get the Q&A box up,
have I? Oh,
there's 3.
Oh, I was on the chat. I am so sorry. You are absolutely right, Poppy. Terrible. Now these are very good questions here. What are the mental resilience skills required to build back better from the recent chaos which society has faced? So what are the mental resilience skills required to build back better from the recent chaos which society has faced? I'll give that one to Poppy.
Yeah, so resilience is a muscle that you can build. So it's not a personality trait and a you know, so that's really, really important to get right. And then when I talk about resilience, and Andy will be able to talk much better about this, but I talk about, first of all, recognizing and self-observation. So actually looking at, you know, what's going on for you. How do you feel physically? How do you feel emotionally? And naming that. You know, in the English language, we're really rubbish at our emotional dictionary. So I always say to people, look up emotional words, and you've got loads of there's loads of websites that are developing our emotional language, because we automatically revert to I think rather than I feel. It's just our culture, and it's fine. It's just recognizing that that's our culture. So actually developing your emotional language and being able to observe and then name the feeling, when you do that, you validate it. So I say to people, speak to yourself like you're your best friend, and have that conversation, instead, with no judgment, with no you're terrible, you're not better than that person, etc. And then the next stage for me is around perspective. So I always ask myself, how will I feel about this today? How will I feel about it in a week's time? And how will I feel about it in a year's time? And when I've actually literally written down those responses, I can have a compassionate dialogue with myself, which is recognizing the issues factually, and validating them, interrupting my thought process with curiosity and asking myself deeper questions around where is this coming from, putting a perspective on that, and then repairing that. And once you can do that for yourself, you can do it for other people, which I think the question is, around society, we then start to, I guess, permeate that out.
That sounds like a great framework, Andy, and the word compassion, which we don't hear enough. Andy?
I think that there is something about that we all have a certain level of resilience within ourselves, and we have all certain sort of coping strategies, as don't necessarily like that term always, but we all have ways of managing and dealing with things. And sometimes we don't necessarily pay attention to those. And sometimes we need to reflect back. We need to look back and think, when I was in a difficult situation before, what did I do? When I need to unwind and when I need to relax, what do I do? Now, some of those are useful. So somebody like myself, I like exercise, like going for walks, runs, the gym, which I've significantly missed during lockdown, and my weight gain has certainly sort of reflected that. But then there's sort of some things that we aren't necessarily always that great, sort of alcohol consumption and certain other sort of things along that. So what we need to do sometimes is revisit what's worked, what has actually worked. When we've been in tough situations before, what has worked and how did we utilize and use those? So really, am I at the point that I can use those skills, or how do I get myself back to that? And that sometimes is a difficult sort of thing. So resilience is very much, and I love that, Poppy, it's a muscle that needs training, and I really love that sort of phrasing.
I think he's going to be using that, Poppy, and you should have patented it.
Just ready for my PowerPoint slides for next year's for our third year nursing students. So I think sometimes it's also about recognizing that where we are now is not where we are 2 years ago in society. So what has actually changed? And we could argue about what's changed, but what has changed for you? What has changed in your life right now from a year ago or 2 years ago? And can you go back to the way it was? Or do you need to change things, and do you need to adapt and change? So some of it is about working patterns and where you're working. And
in fact, Andy, can I interrupt you? Because you're almost coming on to the next question, which I'll then let you keep on talking, which is,
all right, sorry.
Do you believe that a flexible work environment will be a long-term structural change within the UK and could benefit employees' mental health through a better work-life balance? Could benefit employees' mental health through a better work-life balance?
I think that whether you are an individual examining how you're working, or whether you are an organisation examining how you're working, we now have new tools at our hands, and we have new ways of working. And I think that individually and organisationally, we need to examine what is going to be best moving forward into for the future. What have we learned about what works well? Do people work better at home? Do people work better and they can move their lives, and it's much more family friendly working, that they can maybe come on calls a little bit later because they managed to drop off the children, or they've got, managed to take care of a family member, but still are as effective and efficient throughout the day and maybe work better in the evening? Or do people need sort of an office environment? So I think that both individually and organisationally, we need to examine what has worked well. What has come out of this pandemic? What has actually worked? What is working quite well? You know, and what have we kind of learned? And I think that reflection back individually and organizationally, there needs to be those discussions up and down to say, well, actually individually, what has worked well for you? You know, where have you been most productive? Where have you been most efficient? Where can we as an organization help you? But how can I help the organization to be the best I can be, if that makes sense?
It sounds like a constant questioning. Now we are getting to the end. In fact, we've already passed the end. So I'm going to ask each of you for your advice for the day-to-day management of mental health. Poppy, would you like to go first?
So I'd maybe take a business lens to this. In the current climate and the emergence of sort of this hybrid working, there is one thing that has to stay in the middle of all of the future of work discussion, which is mental health and well-being. So I would say to all leaders and managers, make sure that you're connecting with your inclusion leaders, your well-being leaders, holding focus group, pulse surveys to work out what is the right workplace of the future. And experimentation is key. What we're doing today, we won't be doing in 18 months' time. So just keep making sure that mental health is part of that whole change management process, because change is stressful. And, you know, as we were discussing earlier, prevention is key, and that's the way to do it.
And what about on a personal level for the people on this call? Forget that they're executives. What are the 4 or 5 basic things they should be doing?
Well, I would say continue asking how are you, to yourself, to each other, and then continue having a compassionate dialogue and build your, I talked briefly about my stress signature. On the flip side of that, build your well-being toolkit and learn yourself. What are the 5 things that you do to stay connected, to give, to keep moving, to learn new skills, and to take notice? That's the 5 ways to well-being. If you do one of those every single day, you'll build your resilience up.
Thank you, Poppy. And Andy, what about you?
Everything she's just said. No, I think this is a message to anyone that is struggling right now. And my message to you is you matter. You are whether you feel you're a small cog or a big cog in whatever machine you are working in, you matter. And if you are not feeling great, acknowledge that to yourself, and acknowledge that to the ones closest to you first and foremost, and acknowledge that to somebody you feel safe enough in your team or department or company, you feel you can sit there and say, do you know what, I'm not feeling too great. And I think that you'll probably be surprised and shocked that actually probably not many people are feeling great right now. And that's okay to not be okay. But the only thing that matters now is how you make yourself from going not okay to okay.
Thank you very much, Andy and Poppy. And it is about you matter. Every single human being matters. And it's about applying that same compassion that Poppy talked about at one point to yourself and to others. And it's always more difficult to apply it to oneself. So you do matter. And you two matter to us hugely, Poppy and Andy, because you've done a brilliant job covering a complex subject. And also a bit of laughter here, because mental health doesn't have to be something that is so serious that one can't laugh a bit. And don't they say that laughter is a wonderful recipe for any sort of to create mental well-being? So thank you both very, very much. Thank you to the WCIB, to CISI and the Chartered Bankers Institute, and to Max and Rob for organizing this. And I wish you all a very, very good week.